All right, so like 60% of the forum posts kind of go back to grounds. People swap out starters and alternators and all sorts of stuff, and it's unfortunate because a lot of times it could be a lot more of a simple fix than what they're doing. And then, of course, that component fixes the problem. They don't realize it's just because they disconnected stuff and reconnected it that they got good ground again. So let's talk about this for a second. This is your battery positive. This is your battery negative, also called ground, um, sometimes called common. But basically, every single electric component on your vehicle has to get juice from your battery or from the alternator down there, and it has to have a path back to here. Every single thing. If something doesn't have a path back to this on your battery, or the negative on the alternator and then back to the battery, it just won't work. It has to have both. End of story. Now, what happens is if you were to try to get a path back to here from every single component on your car, you'd have cables and wires everywhere. Every single electrical component would have to have a wire coming back here, and you'd have a big old bundle of wires. So that's not very good. So what they do is they strap it to the body here, some other places like there where the strap goes on. So it's important to realize that if any of those connections to the chassis, whether it be where the component is or back up here where it's getting it back out of the chassis and back to the battery negative, any problems with those is going to cause serious problems. So, you sometimes hear old timers talking about how they wish things weren't as electrical or as computerized and the more mechanical. The truth is, this stuff has been needed for cars for a long time, though. If you have bad grounds, even in the 1970s, it's going to cause serious problems. Your ignition needs it. Your timing needs it. Every sensor needs it. All of your lights need it. Just anything that's getting electrical, your starter, right? Just anything that electrical is going to must have a good path back to ground. So when we see those problem posts where somebody can't start, or they get a weak start, or they get a click, click, click when they go to start their engine, so many of those are just ground problems. So where do these guys live? We got the negative battery terminal, which runs over to the chassis ground right there. You can see the cable coming up to the negative battery terminal. We've got the engine block down here. You can see that. Got two bolts there that need to be removed and cleaned and wire brushed and put back on. And then someone was nice enough to remind me on the forums that we got this guy, pretty important, behind the dipstick. And he can be a little hard to catch on film. Let's see if I can. But he lives right there behind the dipstick. Can you see that? So if you just look right behind the dipstick, there's a little bracket, 2 or 3 wires running to a bolt. That's the next one. You got this guy up here on the braided strap, and he runs down behind the valve cover right there. Take that guy off, clean both sides. And then over by the computer, which is right here, we've got these guys hiding right there. So let's zoom out a little bit so you can see right in there. So there, behind the dipstick, engine block, and then of course your negative battery terminal, and you're strapped to the chassis. So here's a way to remember it. Battery to body, engine block, behind the dipstick, one on top. Don't forget to get both sides, and by the computer, another hides. There you go. Little mnemonic for you. The funny thing about a ground is it's not a black or white issue. If you have a bad connection or a broken wire or whatever, it's either off or on. But with grounds, it's more complicated. Grounds are, think of it as like a gray area, because you might get some voltage, but not all the voltage. And of course, electrical components that are, modern electrical components. And by modern, I mean 1996. This is a 96 XJ. And they will not tolerate having voltages in the wrong ranges, And the other thing that stinks about that is if you go to a place like Advanced or AutoZone and you talk to the teenagers, they're going to be like, yep, needs a starter. Yep, looks like the alternator, and they'll test them, they'll load test them, but that's just not the end of the story. They have no idea, and they almost never say, have you checked your grounds? So let's go through the basics. Take these off. If you have the kind where the wires come out of the clamp, take it apart, clean it up. You'd be surprised how nasty those get in there, even when you run a clean vehicle. This vehicle's been super clean for a few months. The corrosion gets in there. It doesn't matter whether it's rainy or salty or snowy or perfectly beautiful weather like what we got. It gets corroded in there, and it's going to happen every time. So take these off, clean them up, get them shiny. When you put them back on, get them tight. You shouldn't be able to move these by hand, right? This guy is super important. This strap that goes to the chassis, make sure he's clean and shiny. If there's rust down there on the chassis, clean that all up. Little brake parts cleaner after you've wire brushed it and stuff can really clean it up. Careful not to get it everywhere. That's super important. This guy, I just want to talk about this. The reason why he's a strap, a lot of people will replace this with a wire. Don't do that. The reason he's a strap is because he helps get radio interference off your radio. So leave him the strap that the factory provided. There's a reason why it's a braided strap. But it's still a ground, and it's really important. So in addition to sensors and things like that not working, a lot of those voltages are being listened to and checked by your computer, your PCM or ECU, and it is going to throw engine codes. It's going to do all sorts of stuff when it doesn't see those voltages being correct. Not to mention the fact that the sensors, like the cam position sensor and the crankshaft position sensor, are very sensitive to that voltage, and they're going to start either having low or high voltage issues, or they're going to start giving bad values. Either which is going to cause all sorts of problems with your starting. So let's get to the basics here. This is something free and cheap and easy that everybody should do before they go swapping starters and alternators and any number of other things, and batteries. Batteries, starters, and alternators, it seems to be the real go-to. You can use a little dielectric grease on the outside of these connections to just protect them from the corrosion and stuff. I don't recommend putting it on the metal-to-metal contact, but that's up to you. Dielectric grease molecularly is pretty big, so the metal squeezes it out of the way and touches metal to metal. That's why you get away with it. However, if you use a product like fluid film, I do not recommend using it, although they say you can. I would not recommend using it on battery terminals or ground connections. And the reason why is it is much smaller molecularly, and it is really hard to get from in between metal components. I learned that the hard way by spraying it on my battery terminals, which they said it was safe to do. That stuff easily crept between the clamp and the battery post, and as soon as it did, I started getting starting issues. So I don't recommend spraying that on electrical metal-to-metal connections like your clamps. It's great stuff, and I use it everywhere on the Jeep, just not for that stuff. And it'll take some time. I sprayed it up here clean, but it worked its way inside that within about 5 days. I was having starting issues. So at least the fix was just pulling it apart and cleaning it up, getting all the fluid film off. All right, so there's your grounds. Clean them up. Make it part of your fall and spring maintenance, because it's definitely going to need it before wintertime, and you can just watch the forums around April and May. Just a slew of these types of problems will start flowing in. It's amazing. They all come in at once. I get a click, click, click when I start. I can't start, or I start and it wants to stall and I need to give it gas. That's because the PCM is rebooting itself. It does not like the low voltage. But they're kind of all the same. They all sound different, but they're all exactly the same problem. And it's almost certain that it's going to happen to you in April or May. And a lot of times it'll happen in the fall, right when the rainy season starts, because you start getting a lot more ambient moisture, and that corrosion that was already kind of on the edge now goes full bore. And so I would recommend October-ish, April-ish, depending on what part of the country you're in. All right, super important stuff, guys. Cheap, easy, free. Don't go swapping parts until you do that.